Hey, Dustin Vanoy here. In this video, we'll take a quick look at creating an Azure Databricks cluster using the UI. Note that you have a few options like command line or REST API for creating your cluster, but let's just use the Azure Portal for the most simple, straightforward option to get started. From your Azure Databricks workspace, go to the Clusters tab and choose Create Cluster. Of course, you'll need a name. I'll call this Demo 1. And you have a few options for cluster mode, high concurrency or standard. Let's stick with standard, which is going to be a little bit cheaper, but if you had a lot of analysts working on it, high concurrency may be the right choice for you. If you need to spin cluster up and down quickly, you could consider using a cluster pool, but you're going to pay more for VMs that are always running. So we will skip that for this example. You want to pick a pretty recent version. We'll just go with the latest and greatest 6.3 as of the time of this video. And in this version, it's only going to support Python 3. You have to go back to the 5.4 or so in order to find ones that support Python 2, if that's a requirement. I tend to not enable autoscaling on test clusters. That's a great feature for production. And I tend to leave it on terminate after 120 minutes or maybe even a little bit less. And I hardly ever use the default workers, especially for tests. So let's go down to 2 workers. We'll take the standard DS3 size. It's a pretty good small size to get started. And we can keep our driver type the same as our worker for now. Let's check out a few of the advanced options. Data Lake Storage Pass-Through is a good feature, but it is limited to premium workspaces, and you need to take a look at what's supported on those clusters before using it. You may have to add some Spark configs. In production, I often have a couple of these. I'll try and cover those in more of a scripted scenario in the future. And environment variables, the defaults are usually fine to get started, but you might find that you want to reference things like key vault secrets, other aspects that you're going to reference from your init scripts later. You can add some tags if you like. You might want to set up logging to go to a Databricks file system folder. And so in my case, I tend to just take the default of put all of my logging from my Spark cluster into my cluster logs so that I can review it later. Init scripts is where you would put any kind of Python installs or other type of setup such as logging setup that you want to happen as the cluster starts up each time. Often I find I have 2 or 3 init scripts I run with every cluster for a given client that I'm working with, but it's something that you can kind of advance into as you start to work with your cluster and find that something needs to be set up or installed every single time. To get started though, we can just create a cluster with hardly any of those options changed, and it'll start to spin up pretty quickly here. I find myself hitting the refresh button in order to see it. It doesn't always pop into the UI right away. And after you refresh, you'll see the cluster in a pending state. It'll take about 5 minutes before it's in a running state, and you can really start to attach notebooks and work with it. So here the cluster is turned on and the state's in running. Let's go ahead and look at a few features of the UI. Creating notebooks is one that takes a lot more time to cover, but if you want to manually add libraries, you can just go to the Libraries tab and click Install New. The event log is a good place to see if it did not start up successfully, or if you want to see who's the last person that started the cluster. Some of those really key events for the cluster creation and cluster run. And then Spark UI is where you would see things like Spark jobs that have run. And this looks a lot like the typical Spark UI, but it's wrapped a little bit because Databricks works a little differently than Apache Spark. Driver logs is where you'll see both your standard out, your standard error, and your log4j messages. So for debugging, this is one place to look, though you'll find that it's a lot easier if you can port this to a search tool like Elasticsearch or Azure Log Analytics. The metrics for the cluster are available via Ganglia if you click here. And finally, the traditional Spark UI is available here, and you'll see that there's always this long-running Databricks shell, and that's why I tend to find myself using this Databricks Spark UI instead. That's kind of the overview of what your cluster has in the UI. Hopefully that's beneficial after you've created your cluster. And then I always like to terminate my cluster manually if I'm thinking about it. If not, it will turn off after 120 minutes as I set it to. So simply clicking the terminate button will shut it down. And then the other thing to keep in mind is just that if you're not on that 14-day trial period, you will be paying for the minutes each worker is running. And so you'll want to keep an eye on how big of workers you use, how many you're running, and make sure it's not running when you're not ready to use it. So that's the overview of creating the cluster with the UI and navigating it. There are some more options available that aren't shown in the UI, and that'll be a topic for another day. If you want to see more content, check out my website or check me out on YouTube.